They said we had 43 days. 43 days before starvation silenced the last human city. The Galactic Empire's orbital blockade was airtight. 17 warships, 0 gaps, and the cold math of inevitability. Every alien strategist, every Imperial analyst, every galactic news cycle agreed. Humanity was finished. They were wrong. If you've ever wondered what happens when the most stubborn species in the known universe gets backed into a corner, you're about to find out. Hit that like button, subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales, and drop a comment below telling me, do you think humanity survives? Because what comes next will change everything you thought you knew about human survival. Now, let's step into the siege that was supposed to end us. Day 1 of the blockade began not with fire, but with silence. Colonel James Hargrove stood on the observation deck of Cheyenne Command, the last functioning military nerve center buried 2,000 feet beneath the Colorado Rockies, and watched the long-range feed with a kind of stillness that came from 30 years of training. Above the atmosphere, 17 Velthari dreadnoughts had taken position in a perfect low-orbit shell. They weren't attacking. They didn't need to. The Galactic Empire of the Velthari had mastered something far more efficient than war. They had mastered waiting. Supply projections, Hargrove said, voice flat. His logistics officer, Major Derek Paulson, pulled up the numbers without flinching, though his jaw was tight. 43 days of nutritional reserves at reduced rations, 31 at standard. After that, he let the silence do the work. After that, 8 billion people would begin to starve. The Velthari hadn't fired a single shot. Their strategy was clinical. They called it a containment protocol, a sanitized phrase for an ancient tactic. Surround, isolate, and let biology do the rest. They had deployed it on 4 other civilizations across the last 2 centuries. None of those civilizations existed anymore. The Velthari saw humanity the same way a geologist sees an inconvenient rock formation, something to be removed efficiently, without drama. The irony was that humanity had seen it coming. The diplomatic collapse 18 months prior had been a slow, grinding train wreck, played out across a dozen Galactic Council sessions. The Velthari had demanded full planetary resource surrender in exchange for protected status, which in practical terms meant Earth would become a mining operation staffed by its own population under Imperial oversight. Earth's United Defense Council had refused, and the Velthari, who had never once been told no by a species that survived the telling, had simply escalated. Now, the skies belonged to them. Hargrove walked the length of the command floor, eyes moving across the tactical displays. 300 personnel worked in focused silence. Satellite imagery showed the orbital ring in crisp detail. Those dreadnoughts weren't just sitting there. They were broadcasting. A constant low-frequency signal designed to interfere with long-range communications, degrade solar energy collection, and most devastatingly, disrupt the GPS-dependent agricultural automation systems that fed 90% of Earth's population. In 2 weeks, the automated harvest grids across North America's breadbasket would begin to fail. In 3 weeks, the protein synthesis facilities in the Pacific coastal hubs would go dark. The Velthari had studied humanity's infrastructure with the thoroughness of surgeons.
Focus on the tubing.
They knew exactly which threads to cut.
Filters are critical.
Options,
Watch the
Hargrove
timer
said,
light.
turning to his war council. The faces around the table: General Susan Raft from the Air Command, Dr. Owen Briggs from Tactical Sciences,
Good. Adjusting
Admiral
oxygen.
Wayne Colton from Naval Defense, and Director Marcus Ellery from the Civilian Resilience Bureau. Each carried the weight of what they already knew. The options were thin. Orbital counterstrike was suicidal. Earth's defense capabilities could perhaps damage 2 of the 17 dreadnoughts before being overwhelmed. A ground-to-space logistics run was impossible. Every attempted launch would be intercepted. Negotiations were off the table. The Velthari had cut the diplomatic channel 3 days before the fleet arrived. "We fight on our terms, not theirs," Hargrove said quietly. "We've done that before." It was Director Ellery who shifted in his seat. He was the oldest person in the room, 67, weathered, with the kind of eyes that had seen things his reports never quite captured. He was also, Hargrove had learned over years of working together, the man most likely to say something that sounded insane, and turned out to be the only thing that mattered. "There's something coming in from the agricultural deep scan teams," Ellery said. "It might be nothing. It might be the strangest thing any of us has heard in a long time. He paused. Dr. Nathan Cole is asking for a direct line. He was leading a geological survey in the Wyoming Basin when the blockade dropped. He stayed down there. Says he found something. Put him through. The voice that came over the line was breathless, not from fear, but from the particular energy of a man who has just discovered something he doesn't yet have words for. Dr. Nathan Cole, 39, geobotanist, spoke in fragments at first. Then he steadied himself. Colonel, Cole said, I need you to listen to something that's going to sound impossible. Because I think our ancestors left us something. Something buried so deep that we forgot it existed. And right now, in the middle of the worst siege in human history, he exhaled. I think we just found our way through. The command room went very quiet. Outside, 43 days away, 8 billion people had no idea that the answer to the empire above them might be growing in the dark beneath their feet. And whatever Dr. Nathan Cole had found in the Wyoming Basin, whatever ancient secret had been sleeping in Earth's deepest soil, was about to change the course of everything. Dr. Nathan Cole had not slept in 31 hours, and he did not look like a man who planned to start anytime soon. He was 6 feet underground in a survey tunnel carved into the Wyoming Basin's bedrock. A space barely wide enough for 2 men to stand side by side, lit by portable LED strings that threw everything in harsh white light. The walls were layered in geological strata, like the pages of a book written across 50,000 years. And there, at a depth that corresponded to the late Pleistocene era, he had found something that had no right to be there. A root system, still alive, not fossilized, not calcified, dormant, but biologically intact. The root structure was unlike anything in the modern botanical catalog. It was dark, almost black at its core, with a fibrous outer membrane that Cole's field spectrometer had already flagged 3 times as unclassifiable. The root ran laterally through the stratum, spreading in a network that his ground-penetrating scans suggested extended across nearly 40 square miles. Cole had initially thought it was a geological anomaly, some kind of mineral deposit that mimicked organic structure. Then he'd taken a tissue sample, and the sample had responded. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have been obvious to anyone without his specific training, but the cellular activity was unmistakable. The root was metabolically active, 40 feet underground, sealed in Pleistocene-era sediment, cut off from sunlight and water for somewhere between 12 and 15,000 years, and it was still running. He had spent the next 4 hours running every test his portable lab could manage. The results kept sharpening the same impossible picture. What we're looking at, Cole told Colonel Hargrove over the secure line, is a pre-agricultural root species, something that existed before the last ice age. Based on the cellular structure, I believe this plant co-evolved with early humans, specifically with the physiological stress conditions of late Pleistocene megafaunal extinction events. Periods of extreme scarcity. Periods where our ancestors were eating nothing, moving constantly, surviving on essentially zero caloric input for weeks at a time. You're saying this plant helped them do that? Not just helped, Cole said. I think it was the mechanism. The cellular compounds I'm finding, particularly a class of alkaloids I can't find in any database, appear to interact with the mitochondrial stress response pathway. In plain language, I think this root doesn't just slow metabolism. I think it rewires it. Temporarily. It appears to shift the body's primary energy source from caloric intake to something closer to directed cellular recycling. The body starts consuming its own non-essential biological material in a very controlled, very efficient way, while simultaneously upregulating cognitive and sensory function. There was a pause on the line. You're describing superpowered starvation, said Dr. Owen Briggs, who had been listening in. I'm describing what our ancestors actually were, Cole said. Before agriculture, before calories became the baseline. The human body has a mode we forgot about, because we stopped needing it 10,000 years ago. This root is the key that unlocks it. Another pause. Sir, if I can get samples to a proper biochemistry lab, if we can synthesize even a crude extract, we might be able to extend the effective survival window of every person on this planet without a single additional calorie of food. Hargrove was already signaling to Marcus Ellery. How much route can you access from your current position? The network is massive, Cole said. We'd need extraction teams, but the raw material is there. The bigger challenge is synthesis. The alkaloid structure is complex. We'd need someone who knows extremophile biochemistry and isn't afraid to work fast under pressure. I know someone, Ellery said quietly. Her name was Dr. Rachel Hames, and she was arguably the best extremophile biochemist alive, which was why she'd been on the Velthari's list of requested scientific transfers before the blockade fell. She was currently at the Denver Underground Research Facility, 70 miles from Cole's position, and when Ellery reached her and explained what Cole had found, she was silent for exactly 4 seconds before saying, "Send me everything. I'll have a preliminary synthesis model in 8 hours." 8 hours and 14 minutes later, she called back. "It's real," she said. "The alkaloid complex is unlike anything in the pharmaceutical literature. But the mechanism is coherent. It's not magic. It's just biology we stopped paying attention to." She sounded simultaneously exhausted and electrified. "I can synthesize a viable extract using modified fermentation methods, standard lab equipment, nothing the Empire has flagged as restricted. We can brew this in basements if we have to." "We may have to," Ellery said. And that was the moment the operation began. Not with a military order, not with a weapons system coming online, but with a biochemist in a basement lab and a geobotanist 40 feet underground, building something the Velthari Empire had never thought to model for. Because the Empire had scanned humanity's food stores, they had mapped the logistics networks, they had calculated the caloric mathematics of a species running down to zero. What they had never thought to look for was what humanity did when the calories ran out. 3 days into the operation, the first batch of extract was ready, and on day 4, Colonel James Hargrove became the first person in 15,000 years to drink something brewed from the roots of the old world. He expected nothing. He was a practical man. What happened over the next 6 hours was not nothing. Hargrove had been awake for 40 hours when he took the first dose. He expected, if it worked at all, a modest reduction in the hunger gnawing at the edge of his focus. What he did not expect was clarity. It came on gradually, over about 90 minutes. The hunger didn't disappear. It transformed. It became something distant, almost academic, like background noise in another room. But in its place something else sharpened. His thoughts moved with a precision that felt surgical. He found himself reading tactical reports he'd reviewed a dozen times and seeing patterns he hadn't registered before. Supply chain vulnerabilities in the Empire's sensor array positioning, timing windows in the Dreadnought's orbital rotation that his team had dismissed as irrelevant. He pulled his map and started drawing lines. When Major Paulson found him 4 hours later, Hargrove had filled 12 pages of tactical notes. "You look different," Paulson said. "I feel like I can see the whole board," Hargrove said. He wasn't being poetic. He meant it literally. The relationship between all the moving parts of the Imperial blockade, the sensor arrays, the communications disruption, the orbital timing, the supply chain dependencies, had arranged itself in his mind into a single coherent picture. "Get me Cole and Haynes on a call. And get this to Briggs. We're not just surviving this siege, we're going to end it." The distribution challenge was enormous. Earth's population was 8 billion people spread across every continent, climate zone, and political jurisdiction. Getting a synthesized botanical extract, brewed from a prehistoric root that nobody had heard of 3 weeks ago, to the majority of that population, secretly, while an alien empire monitored all major logistics systems from orbit, was not a small problem. It was, however, a human problem, and humans had been solving logistical impossibilities for a long time. Director Ellery coordinated what became known internally as the Root Network, a distributed production and distribution system that deliberately mimicked the structure of the root itself, decentralized, redundant, and impossible to take out with a single strike. Extraction teams were deployed to the Wyoming Basin and to 3 secondary root sites that Cole's expanded geological surveys had identified in Montana, Tennessee, and the Appalachian Deep Strata. Haynes trained 40 biochemists in the synthesis process over a 2-day crash course that she described as the most important fermentation class in the history of our species. The brewing happened everywhere. In hospital basements, in university chemistry departments, in industrial kitchens repurposed overnight, in old brewery facilities that had been sitting idle since the blockade disrupted supply chains. The extract was brewed in batches, packaged into standard hydration units, visually indistinguishable from the water rations being distributed through the civilian resilience infrastructure, and moved through a delivery network that had been operating under the Empire's radar for years, the same community volunteer systems that had handled disaster relief, food banks, and neighborhood supply chains for generations. The Velthari sensors were looking for military movement. They were looking for energy signatures, launches, weapons charging, communication bursts. They were not looking for people doing what people had always done in a crisis, quietly taking care of each other. By day 12, an estimated 200 million people across North America had received a first dose. By day 18, the number had crossed 800 million globally, and something extraordinary was happening. The Velthari's predictive models, built on centuries of data from species under siege, expected a specific physiological signature by day 15. Measurable decline in population-scale metabolic activity, slower movement patterns, reduced thermal output in residential zones, behavioral shifts consistent with acute malnutrition, shorter activity windows, reduced coordination, cognitive degradation visible in communication patterns. The models were showing none of it. In fact, the data coming back from the Empire's passive surveillance systems was confusing. Activity levels in human residential zones were stable. Thermal signatures from population centers were unchanged. The communication intercepts, which the Empire monitored carefully for signs of despair, internal conflict, and the political fracturing that typically preceded a civilization's capitulation, showed no increase in panic or social breakdown. If anything, they showed an uptick in coordinated activity. People were moving. People were working. People were quiet in a way that felt to the Empire's analysts, less like defeat and more like focus. On Imperial Dreadnought Sovereign Meridian, Fleet Commander Varric Salas reviewed the anomalous data with growing unease. He was a decorated officer, methodical and precise, with 7 successful containment protocols on his record. He knew what a species looked like when it was dying. He had watched it happen. He had documented it. This did not look like that. Run the projection again, he told his chief analyst. The analyst ran it again. The result was the same. By any model they had, Earth should be showing cascade failure across its population centers within the next 12 days. Instead, the sensors showed something the model had no category for, a species running on empty, but moving like it was full. Salas stared at the data for a long moment. Then he sent a priority signal to the Imperial Strategic Command. There is an anomaly, he wrote. I recommend additional analysis before we proceed to Phase 2. He did not yet know what the anomaly was, but somewhere beneath him, 40 feet underground in Wyoming, in basements across 100 cities, in the quiet hands of ordinary people distributing small bottles of dark liquid, humanity had already figured it out. And Colonel Hargrove, sharp-eyed and clear-headed on his 12th consecutive day without a full meal, was looking at the Empire's orbital positioning with new eyes. The gap was not a physical hole in the Empire's blockade. It was a timing window, a 17-minute overlap in the sensor rotation of Dreadnoughts 3 and 7, occurring every 41 hours when the ship's individual patrol cycles briefly aligned in the same arc. During those 17 minutes, a narrow corridor of low-altitude orbital space went effectively unmonitored by the Empire's primary arrays. 17 minutes was not enough to launch a counterattack. It wasn't enough to evacuate. It wasn't enough to do most of the things a military mind would immediately reach for. But it was enough to transmit. We've been focused on surviving the blockade, Hargrove told his war council on day 22. But the Empire isn't operating in a vacuum. They have a political structure. They have a council. They have internal factions. We know this from the pre-blockade diplomatic records. Fleet Commander Salas reports to an Imperial Strategic Command that reports to a governing council that has 17 member worlds with 17 different sets of interests. He paused, letting that land. We need to stop thinking about this as a military problem and start thinking about it as a political one. Dr. Owen Briggs leaned forward. You want to transmit directly to the council? Not the council, Hargrove said. The opposition voices within the council. We know there are Velthari political figures who oppose the containment of Earth. Some of them went quiet when the fleet launched because they were afraid. We're going to give them something to work with. What Hargrove intended to send was not a plea for help. It was not a negotiation offer. It was something the Empire had never received from a species under containment, because no species under containment had ever been in a position to send it. Evidence. Detailed physiological data on the root extract's effects. Population-scale metabolic readings that demonstrated humanity's continued function on near-zero caloric intake. Biochemical analysis from Haynes' lab showing the mechanism, the ancient alkaloid pathway, the mitochondrial rewiring, the cognitive enhancement under scarcity. And alongside the science, something else. A message. "We are not dying," Hargrove wrote in the transmission's opening. "We are remembering, and what we are remembering is older than your empire." The transmission was compressed, encrypted, and designed to look like background stellar interference on the Empire's passive monitors. Dr. Cole, who had over 3 weeks on the extract, developed what he described as a preposterous degree of pattern recognition, had reverse-engineered the Empire's sensor algorithms well enough to design a signal that would pass their automated filters. It went out on day 23, through the 17-minute window, broadcast on a sub-band frequency that the Empire used for geological survey data. In the Empire's communications infrastructure, it would look like noise. To any analyst specifically looking for an intelligent signal in that band, it would look like a species that refused to cooperate with its own extinction. On the ground, the changes in humanity were becoming impossible to ignore, even for those who hadn't been part of the initial briefings. People who had been on the extract for 2 weeks were reporting sensory experiences that felt almost dissonant with their circumstances. In cities where food supplies had nominally run out, where the automated agriculture grids had gone dark, and the protein synthesis plants had shut down, people were not collapsing. They were alert, they were organized. In Boston, a civilian engineering team of 14 people, none of them military, none of them trained for the work, had reverse-engineered the Velthari's orbital communication relay system using only public domain astrophysics, and what their lead engineer described as 3 weeks of not sleeping, and being weirdly okay with it. In Houston, a group of retired aerospace workers had begun mapping the acoustic signatures of the Dreadnought's drive systems using modified seismic sensors, originally built for earthquake monitoring, and had produced a predictive movement model that matched the Empire's actual patrol rotations to within 2%. In Chicago, a biochemistry professor named Dr. Thomas Walsh had independently developed a second-generation synthesis protocol for the extract that tripled production efficiency using equipment available in any high school lab. These were not soldiers. They were a retired aerospace worker in Houston, a biochemist in Chicago, an engineering team in Boston. Ordinary people running on an ancient biological mode that their species had forgotten for 10,000 years and had just remembered under the worst possible pressure. On Sovereign Meridian, Fleet Commander Solace was no longer experiencing mild unease. He was experiencing something he had never felt in 30 years of Imperial service, the specific, cold discomfort of a hunter who has just realized that the animal he is tracking has been watching him back. His sensors still showed no military buildup, no weapons charging, no launch preparation, no conventional resistance at all. What they showed was a species that had been under total resource blockade for 23 days and was somehow getting sharper. He pulled up the transmission logs from the 17-minute sensor gap on day 23. He almost missed it. The signal was designed to be missed. But Solace was a thorough man, and something in the geological survey band had caught his attention. The data was too structured, too intentional. He ran a compression analysis. His blood, metaphorically speaking, as the Veltari had a different circulatory chemistry, ran cold. "Get me a full spectrum analysis of every signal that passed through the sensor gap," he ordered. "And get me a xenobiologist, now." He did not yet know exactly what humanity had done, but he knew, with the bone-deep certainty of an experienced commander, that the game had changed. The Imperial response came not as an escalation of force, but as something Hargrove had not quite prepared for: confusion at the highest level. On day 27, the Empire's diplomatic channel, which had been dead since before the fleet arrived, reopened, not from Fleet Commander Solace, from someone higher. The message was brief, and it came from a name that Ellery recognized immediately from the pre-blockade council records. Councillor Dran Veith, one of the 3 Velthari political figures who had voted against the Earth Containment Protocol 18 months prior. He had gone silent when the fleet launched. He was apparently silent no longer. "We have received your transmission," the message read. "We are reviewing it. No response is required at this time. We ask only that you continue to document what you are doing." Hargrove read it twice. Then he looked at Ellery. "They want us to keep sending data," Ellery said slowly. "We've given the opposition faction something they can actually use." "We gave them proof," Hargrove said, "that we're not dying on their schedule. That changes the political math for everyone who opposed this blockade but didn't have grounds to push back." He authorized a second transmission immediately. This one was larger. It included 30 days of population-scale physiological data, the full biochemical analysis from Haynes' lab, Cole's geological survey documentation, and something new: testimonial records, voice and text accounts from civilians across 12 cities and 6 continents, engineers, teachers, medical workers, farmers, describing their experience on the extract in plain, specific human terms. Not military reports, not scientific abstracts. The actual words of actual people who had gone 3 weeks without adequate food, and were, inexplicably, doing fine. "We want them to see us," Hargrove told his council. "Not a civilization." On Sovereign Meridian, Solace had spent 4 days in the company of his xenobiologist, a specialist named Tren Ivas, who studied the biological adaptation patterns of contested species, and what Ivas had told him had methodically dismantled every certainty Solace had carried into this operation. "The compound they've isolated," Ivas said, "is not synthetic. It's not a pharmaceutical intervention. It's an endogenous evolutionary pathway that apparently persisted in a dormant botanical form in their planet's geological substrate." He paused. "In plain terms, Commander, they found a biological memory. Their planet remembered something about them that they had forgotten." "What does it do?" Solace asked. "It extends their functional capacity under resource deprivation by a factor that our models have never accounted for," Ivas said. "And it does something else." He hesitated, as though he hadn't quite figured out how to say the next part. "It enhances cognitive processing. Specifically, under conditions of stress and scarcity. It appears the human nervous system, when running on this pathway, operates with significantly greater efficiency than it does under normal nutritional conditions." Solace stared at him. "They get smarter when they're starving?" "Not precisely," Ivas said. "They get clearer. The cognitive noise that accompanies comfort and abundance reduces. They become very focused, very fast, very difficult to predict." Another pause. "Commander, our entire containment protocol is predicated on the biological degradation curve of the target species. If that curve has been effectively eliminated..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The tactical picture had inverted. The Empire had designed a trap, and their prey had found a way to exist outside the trap's fundamental assumption. And now, 30 days in, humanity wasn't just surviving, it was operating. The sabotage began on day 29. It was not dramatic. There were no explosions, no heroic space battles, no massive military operations. What there was, a series of small, precise, extraordinarily well-coordinated acts of technical interference, executed by people who had spent 30 days developing an almost supernatural clarity about the systems they were targeting. The Houston acoustic team's movement model, accurate to within 2%, allowed them to identify the brief windows when Dreadnoughts 3 and 7 were at maximum orbital distance from their nearest support ship. During those windows, a series of high-altitude weather balloons, modified with signal broadcasting hardware built from salvaged components, sent precisely targeted electromagnetic pulses into the sensor array relay nodes that connected the 7 ships in the blockade's Western Hemisphere arc. The pulses didn't destroy the arrays. They introduced subtle calibration errors, small enough to pass initial diagnostic checks, significant enough that the sensor coverage map now had 4 additional gaps that the Empire's automated systems didn't know to look for. The Boston engineering team had already identified those gaps and was using them. More transmissions went out, more data, more human voices, and alongside them, something new: documentation of the sabotage itself, sent directly to Counselor V's channel. Not to threaten, not to boast, to demonstrate. "We are not asking for rescue," Hargrove's message read. "We are showing you what happens when you underestimate us. We can do this indefinitely." The question for your council is whether you would like to find out exactly how much indefinitely costs. On day 31, Councillor Veith called an emergency session of the Velthari Governing Council. The agenda, according to the intercepted summary that reached Hargrove's desk 40 hours later via Veith's channel, contained one item: the reclassification of Earth from containment protocol status. The session lasted 11 hours. Hargrove's team monitored every signal they could pull from the Imperial communication bands. The outcome was not immediate. Imperial councils didn't move fast. But the signals that came out of that session told a story that Hargrove's sharpened, extract-cleared mind read immediately. The hunters were disagreeing about the hunt. And a species that had survived ice ages, extinction events, and 15,000 years of forgetting who it really was about to remind the galaxy of something important. The Velthari fleet began its withdrawal on day 38. It did not happen with a dramatic announcement. There was no formal declaration of defeat, no ceremony, no moment of symbolic surrender. The dreadnoughts simply began adjusting their orbital positions, first the outermost ships, then the middle ring, pulling back in a slow, deliberate arc that any competent military observer would recognize as a tactical retreat, executed with the dignity of a force that was choosing to leave rather than being forced to run. Fleet Commander Varric Solis filed his final operational report from Sovereign Meridian as the fleet formed up for the transit burn out of Earth's orbital zone. The report was, by Imperial standards, extraordinarily brief. Most of it was technical. The last paragraph was not. The containment protocol was discontinued on recommendation of the Governing Council, he wrote, following a reassessment of the target species' biological and strategic profile. It is the assessment of this command that the original protocol was based on an incomplete model of human physiological capacity. The relevant gap in our intelligence was not technical. We knew their infrastructure. We knew their logistics. We knew their caloric reserves. A pause in the syntax, visible even in a written report. We did not know what they were. We recommend that future strategic planning regarding Earth classification account for the following. This species does not have a reliable biological degradation curve under conditions of resource scarcity. Their ceiling is at present unknown. He submitted the report. Then he watched Earth shrink in the aft observation port as the fleet burned for deep space. And he thought about the data packet that Tren Ivas had shown him. The testimonials, the ordinary human voices talking about 3 weeks without food, and the strange, clear, wide-awake quality of the days. He thought about the fact that humanity had not fought back with weapons. They had fought back with their own biology, with something they had found in the ground, something their planet had kept for them across 15,000 years of forgetting. He did not feel defeated exactly. He felt, for the first time in a long career, like he had been shown something he had not known to look for. On the ground, the news of the fleet's withdrawal moved through the population like something between a shockwave and a dawn. People who had been on the extract for a month, running lean and sharp and focused in ways they had no previous reference point for, received the news with a quiet that outside observers might have mistaken for anticlimax. It wasn't that. It was something more considered. Colonel James Hargrove stood on the observation deck of Cheyenne Command and watched the long-range feed as the last dreadnought cleared Earth's orbital zone. Major Paulson stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. 38 days, Paulson said finally. They gave us 43, Hargrove said. We didn't need them. Dr. Nathan Cole was still in Wyoming when the withdrawal was confirmed. He was standing at the entrance to the survey tunnel, blinking in the pale morning light after a month of mostly underground work. And when the message came through on his field communicator, he read it twice, then sat down on the edge of the rock cut and looked out across the basin. Somewhere 40 feet below him, the root network was still running, quiet, patient, old beyond imagination, alive in the dark. He thought about the fact that it had been there the whole time, through every war, every famine, every age of human forgetting. It had waited. Dr. Rachel Haynes was already fielding calls from 17 research institutions when the withdrawal was announced. The biochemical data from the past month was going to occupy the scientific community for years. The alkaloid pathway they had documented, what Haynes had started informally calling the endurance complex, was already raising questions that went far beyond the immediate crisis. What else did the human body know how to do that it had been given no reason to remember? What other ancient capacities were sitting dormant, waiting for the kind of pressure that would call them back? We didn't discover something new, Haynes told a colleague that morning, still running on the extract's familiar clarity, still thinking in the sharp, uncluttered way she had come to take for granted over the past month. We remembered something old. There's a difference, and I think the difference matters. It did matter. It would matter for a long time. In the months that followed, the root network that Director Ellery had built didn't disappear, it evolved. The decentralized production and distribution infrastructure that had moved the extract across 8 billion people under imperial surveillance turned out to be extraordinarily good at moving other things: medical supplies, agricultural resources, technical knowledge, the kind of community-scale problem-solving that had always been humanity's quiet specialty and had never quite had a structure to run through. The root itself became the subject of the most intensive botanical and biochemical research program in human history. Cole's geological surveys, expanded with new funding and 40 new teams, mapped the full extent of the subterranean network, which turned out to cover significant portions of every continent, a root system so ancient and vast that some researchers began referring to it not as a plant, but as a planetary organ, something Earth had grown alongside its most persistent inhabitants, something that had endured every extinction event, every ice age, every catastrophic planetary shift, and had kept, in its cellular memory, the instructions for the species it had co-evolved with. The Velthari Governing Council, in the aftermath of the blockade's failure, entered a period of significant internal political restructuring. Councillor Dran Vyth, whose emergency session had been the turning point, became one of the more prominent figures in the subsequent debate about the Empire's approach to emerging civilizations. He never spoke publicly about the transmissions he had received from Earth, but in a private communication to Hargrove, sent 2 months after the withdrawal, through a diplomatic channel that had quietly reopened, he wrote something brief. The data you sent us was persuasive, the voices were more so. We had studied your species for 40 years before the blockade. We believed we understood you. We were studying the wrong thing. Hargrove kept that message. He read it occasionally, in the same way he had come to read the quiet data from the post-blockade physiological studies, with the particular attention of a man who has learned, at significant cost, to look at the whole picture. On HFY Endurance Tales, stories like this one are remembered not because humanity fought harder or built better weapons, but because when everything was stripped away, when the comfortable abundance that masks what we really are was removed, what was left was something the galaxy had never seen before and did not know how to account for. The Velthari had studied humanity's infrastructure. They had mapped its logistics, its food systems, its technological dependencies. They had built a perfect trap around a species they believed they understood. They had never looked at the ground. They had never asked what grows in the dark. They had never considered that a civilization 43 days from extinction might be sitting on top of 15,000 years of itself, dormant, patient, waiting to be remembered. The root is still there, 40 feet down in the Wyoming Basin, and 100 other places under the skin of a world that has survived things no external force could account for. It doesn't know about empires, it doesn't know about blockades or dreadnoughts or containment protocols. It knows one thing, and it has known it longer than we have been what we are. When it gets hard enough, we remember. If this story hit different, if you felt something in this one, drop a comment below, and tell me what moment got you. Share this with someone who needs to remember what humans are actually capable of. Every share keeps stories like this alive, and there are so many more where this one came from. Stay with HFY Endurance Tales.